Hi, I'm Jim Luby. I'm a professor in the Department of Horticultural Science at the University of Minnesota, and I'm here at our test orchard at the North Central Research and Outreach Center. In this orchard, which you'll see around me, we test the selections from our breeding program, as well as a number of varieties that are maybe either new or have been grown for many, many years in North Central Minnesota. So we plant trees regularly. You can see here some of the smaller, younger trees that we've just put in the last couple of years. And then we've got trees going back to the beginning of this orchard in the year 2000. One of the main things we're looking for in this orchard is survival of our winters in northern Minnesota. And you can see behind me here some of the differences we see. On this side here we have the variety Paula Red, which actually was selected in Michigan, and you can see it's not really too happy in our part of the world. Here we've got a selection from the University of Minnesota breeding program that's doing much better. So this is part of what we're trying to do here, is see some of these differences in how well apple trees survive the winter. University of Minnesota apple breeding program has been going since 1908, over 110 years, and in that time there's been 27 varieties introduced, and not all of them do well in northern Minnesota, but this is one of the more recent ones that has done very well in our tests here at the North Central Research and Outreach Center. This is the variety Zestar, which came out in the late 1990s. It's an early season apple, so it ripens in north central Minnesota before we get our first killing frost. And then, as you can see from the tree around me, it has stayed very healthy, in this case, through about 20 winters. In addition to our Minnesota climate, one of the other big challenges we have to growing apples in Minnesota is that other animals like them just about as much as we do. And in virtually all the state, we've got to be worried about deer coming into an orchard, and in this part of Minnesota, we've even got to be worried about black bears coming into the orchard too. So what's going to be necessary to grow apples in Minnesota is some kind of exclusion fencing. And this is the example we use here. Typically the fences should be some kind of woven wire product and about 10 feet tall to keep deer from jumping over them. And then going down at the bottom all the way to the ground to make sure that the deer do not also try to get under them. All apple varieties are grafted onto a rootstock. We call this clonal propagation or asexual propagation, and this way we get an exact copy of the variety. What this means is that a stick of one of the varieties is actually used to graft onto a root system of another variety. And we use different, what we call rootstocks, for two reasons. One of them is to get a hardy rootstock that can survive cold soil temperatures, and another reason is to get dwarfing, and we can see that here in the orchard. Right behind me here is a dwarf tree grafted on B9 rootstock, and it makes for a nice tree that I can reach almost all of just from the ground. One thing they do require though is support with a stake or something like it to be sure that they will stand up even in windstorms and with a heavy crop load that we might get. We can also use semi-dwarf rootstock, which you'll see back in the row behind me, and that will give a tree that's more in the range of about 15 feet tall. But it has the advantage of being able to stand on its own without a stake for support. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both kinds of rootstock. You can see this healthy row of apple trees, which was planted in the year 2000, represents some of the more hardy varieties we can grow in Minnesota. Many of these are actually derived from a Siberian crabapple species. So some of them, like this rescue crab here, is going to have very small fruit, but will survive just about any Minnesota winter. The fruit ripen early enough to be harvested in even our shorter seasons. And then that Siberian crab also brings in the benefit of giving us some resistance to the fungal disease apple scab. So in addition to evaluating the trees, of course, we also want to evaluate the fruit in our testing program. That's the part that we're interested in eating. What we do is usually harvest at a couple different times on each tree to try to make sure we catch the fruit at the right stage of maturity. And then that fruit is, we slice it, We look at its maturity based on actually spraying some iodine on it, which reacts with the starch, and make sure that's at the right level of maturity. And then we basically have to test it for its texture and its flavor.